The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a dense maze of towering trees and thick undergrowth. It was an unforgiving landscape, teeming with hidden dangers and unpredictable wildlife. A group of highly trained soldiers moved cautiously through the wilderness, their senses sharp and their focus unwavering. This was a routine training mission, meant to test their endurance and survival skills in harsh conditions. They were accustomed to the challenges nature threw at them: unpredictable weather, uneven terrain, and the ever-present silence of the deep forest. The soldiers moved in formation, stepping carefully over twisted roots and fallen branches. Sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced with each step they took. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. Everything seemed normal, another day of rigorous training, until an unexpected sound shattered the stillness. A cry. It was distant but unmistakable. A long, deep wail that sent shivers down their spines. The soldiers froze, exchanging wary glances. It was not the sound of the wind or the call of a bird. It was something else entirely, something filled with unmistakable pain and desperation. The cry came again, louder this time. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling like a plea for help. The sound was raw, almost human in its distress. The men had been trained to handle combat situations, to remain calm under pressure, but this was different. This was something they had never encountered before. Instinct kicked in. Their leader raised a hand, signaling for silence. The team remained motionless, straining their ears to pinpoint the source of the cry. Their hearts pounded in their chests as anticipation filled the air. Then another cry, closer now, trembling with agony. Whatever was making that sound was suffering, and it was nearby. The soldiers exchanged a quick nod. Without hesitation, they adjusted their gear and set off toward the source of the sound, their movements careful but determined. They had no idea what awaited them, but one thing was certain: something in the forest needed help, and they were going to find it. The soldiers advanced with careful precision, their senses heightened. Each step was calculated, their boots pressing into the damp earth without making a sound. The cries continued, cutting through the stillness of the forest like a haunting melody. They were getting closer. Thick branches and tangled undergrowth made the journey slow. The dense foliage obscured their vision, forcing them to rely on their instincts. Their training had taught them to assess their surroundings at all times, to expect the unexpected. Yet as they moved deeper into the woods, a strange unease settled over them. The sound they were following was different from any distress call they had heard before. It lacked the sharpness of a wounded predator or the short, panicked whimpers of smaller animals caught in danger. This cry was deep and drawn out, carrying a weight of suffering so profound that it sent chills down their spines. One of the soldiers raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. The cries had grown louder, more desperate. They were close now, but approaching blindly could be dangerous. They scanned their surroundings, their eyes darting between the thick trees and the shadows stretching across the ground. Then they saw it. Just beyond a small clearing, partially hidden between two fallen logs, lay a massive bear. Its thick fur was matted with dirt, its enormous body tense with pain. The soldiers instinctively gripped their weapons, but the bear was not attacking. It was trapped. A crude snare, likely set by poachers, had ensnared the bear's hind leg. The metal wire had tightened around its flesh, cutting deep. Every time the bear tried to move, the trap dug in further, sending waves of agony through its body. Blood stained the ground beneath it. The soldiers remained still, watching as the bear let out another agonized cry, its powerful frame trembling with exhaustion. It had been struggling for a long time, the fight draining its strength. One of the soldiers whispered under his breath, his voice barely audible. They had encountered many threats before: wild animals, dangerous terrain, and hostile situations. But this was different. This was not a predator waiting to attack. It was a living creature in unbearable pain, unable to escape on its own. They had found the source of the cries, but now came the real challenge. What were they going to do next? The soldiers stood frozen, their eyes locked on the massive bear struggling against its cruel restraint. It was a fully grown adult, its powerful body now weakened by exhaustion and pain. The snare had wrapped tightly around its hind leg, the metal biting deep into its flesh. Blood had seeped into the earth, creating dark patches beneath its enormous paws. The beast had likely been trapped for hours, maybe even days, fighting a losing battle against the unforgiving grip of the wire. Despite its weakened state, the bear was still dangerous. A creature of such size and strength could turn lethal in an instant. One wrong move, one step too close, and the soldiers could become the next victims. The bear let out a deep, guttural groan, its chest rising and falling in heavy, labored breaths. Its eyes flickered with both pain and wariness, the instincts of a wild animal still present despite its suffering. The soldiers exchanged silent glances, their expressions tense. They had encountered dangerous wildlife before, but never a situation like this. The bear was not their enemy. It was a victim of human greed, of poachers who had left their traps hidden in the depths of the forest, uncaring of the suffering they cause. One of the soldiers clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the metal wire that held the bear captive. The creature had tried everything to free itself, evident by the disturbed ground around it. The claw marks on nearby trees where it had thrashed in desperation. But there was no escaping a snare like this. It was designed to kill slowly, to exhaust its victim until it could fight no longer. The bear let out another pained groan, its head lowering slightly. It was too weak to keep resisting, but its breathing remained steady. It was still aware of its surroundings, still capable of defending itself if threatened. The soldiers knew they had to act, but they also knew the risks. If they approached too quickly, the bear could lash out, using what little strength it had left to fight back. If they hesitated too long, the creature might succumb to its injuries before they could do anything to help. It was a delicate balance, one that required both caution and courage. One thing was clear: the bear could not free itself, and if they walked away, it would die here, alone and in agony. The soldiers had a choice to make, and they had to make it fast. The soldiers remained motionless, their eyes locked on the massive bear struggling against its cruel restraint. It was a fully grown adult, its powerful body now weakened by exhaustion and pain. The snare had wrapped tightly around its hind leg, the metal biting deep into its flesh. Blood had seeped into the earth, creating dark patches beneath its enormous paws. The beast had likely been trapped for hours, maybe even days, fighting a losing battle against the unforgiving grip of the wire. Despite its weakened state, the bear was still dangerous. A creature of such size and strength could turn lethal in an instant. One wrong move, one step too close, and the soldiers could become the next victims. The bear let out a deep, guttural groan, its chest rising and falling in heavy, labored breaths. Its eyes flickered with both pain and wariness, the instincts of a wild animal still present despite its suffering. The soldiers exchanged silent glances, their expressions tense. They had encountered dangerous wildlife before, but never a situation like this. The bear was not their enemy. It was a victim of human greed, of poachers who had left their traps hidden in the depths of the forest, uncaring of the suffering they caused. One of the soldiers clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the metal wire that held the bear captive. The creature had tried everything to free itself, evident by the disturbed ground around it, the claw marks on nearby trees where it had thrashed in desperation. But there was no escaping a snare like this. It was designed to kill slowly, to exhaust its victim until it could fight no longer. The bear let out another pained groan, its head lowering slightly. It was too weak to keep resisting, but its breathing remained steady. It was still aware of its surroundings, still capable of defending itself if threatened. The soldiers knew they had to act, but they also knew the risks. If they approached too quickly, the bear could lash out, using what little strength it had left to fight back. If they hesitated too long, the creature might succumb to its injuries before they could do anything to help. It was a delicate balance, one that required both caution and courage. One thing was clear: the bear could not free itself, and if they walked away, it would die here, alone and in agony. The soldiers had a choice to make, and they had to make it fast. The soldiers knew they could not leave the bear in this state. It was suffering, its strength fading with each passing moment. But freeing it was no simple task. The animal was still dangerous, and a single mistake could turn their rescue attempt into a deadly encounter. They huddled together, speaking in hushed voices as they discussed their options. Some hesitated, fearing that the moment the bear was free, it would lash out in panic. Others insisted that they had a responsibility to help, that they could not simply walk away and let it die. Their leader weighed the risks. Approaching the bear directly was too dangerous. Even in its weakened state, it could still cause serious harm. They needed a strategy, one that would keep both them and the animal safe. Looking around, the soldiers assessed their surroundings. They had their survival knives and a few compact tools in their packs, but cutting through the thick metal wire would require time. Time they did not have. The bear's condition was worsening, its heavy breaths coming in ragged intervals. They had to act quickly. One of the soldiers suggested a diversion. If they could distract the bear, keeping its attention focused away from the snare, someone could work on cutting the wire. It was risky, but it was their best option. They assigned roles carefully. A few soldiers would stand at a safe distance, making small movements and noises to keep the bear's focus on them. The others would stay low, creeping closer to the snare, ready to work as soon as the bear was sufficiently distracted. The plan was simple, but execution would be difficult. The bear might panic the moment it felt movement near its injured leg. They had to be prepared for anything. Taking a deep breath, one of the soldiers signaled to begin. The designated team moved slowly, making sure to stay within the bear's line of sight without provoking it. They shuffled their feet, rustled nearby leaves, and spoke in calm, steady tones. The bear lifted its head slightly, its eyes tracking their movements. It was working. Meanwhile, another soldier crept forward, gripping a sturdy knife. He crouched low, inching toward the metal snare. The bear let out a warning groan, shifting its weight slightly. The soldier froze, heart pounding. He waited, barely breathing, until the bear turned its focus back to the distraction team. This was their chance. With steady hands, he reached out and began working on the wire. Every movement had to be precise. One mistake, one sudden noise, and the bear might react unpredictably. Sweat trickled down his brow as he sawed at the snare, each second stretching into eternity. They were committed now. There was no turning back. The soldier's hands trembled slightly as he worked at the thick metal snare, the blade of his knife pressing against the wire that had dug deep into the bear's flesh. Every movement had to be precise. If he applied too much pressure in the wrong spot, the bear might react violently. If he took too long, the creature's suffering would only worsen. The bear let out a low, guttural growl, sensing the movement near its leg. Its body tensed, its muscles twitching with pain and instinctive resistance. The distraction team remained steady, keeping the bear's focus on them, whispering softly and shifting their positions just enough to keep its gaze locked on them. But it wasn't enough to fully calm the animal. It knew something was happening. The soldier cutting the snare gritted his teeth. The wire was thicker than expected, and despite his careful effort, it was stubborn. The sharp edge of the knife barely made progress. He needed to act faster. He reached into his pouch, pulling out a small, multi-tool with a wire cutter. This would be the only way to break the snare cleanly. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he positioned the cutter over the wire. His fingers were steady, but his heart pounded. The bear shifted again, growling in discomfort. He held his breath, squeezing the handles of the cutter with all his strength. A loud snap echoed through the forest. The wire broke. The bear let out a sudden, sharp grunt, jerking its leg away. The soldier instinctively stumbled back, gripping his knife tightly in case the animal reacted aggressively. The other soldiers tensed, their eyes locked on the massive creature. For a moment, time stood still. The bear pulled its wounded leg closer to its body, breathing heavily. It did not move, only staring at the men who had freed it. The silence was unbearable, thick with uncertainty. Then the bear shifted, testing its injured leg. It winced but did not lash out. Instead, it let out a deep, almost tired breath, lowering its head slightly. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The snare was gone, but now they faced an even greater challenge. What would the bear do next? Would it recognize their help, or would instinct take over, causing it to attack? They remained frozen, waiting for the bear's next move. Knowing that in the wild, trust was not easily given. The soldiers stood frozen, watching the bear with unwavering focus. It was free, yet it did not move, as if unsure of what had just happened. The massive creature shifted its weight slightly, pulling its injured leg closer and inspecting it with slow, deliberate movements. The silence was overwhelming. No rustling of leaves, no distant calls of birds, just the heavy breathing of both the soldiers and the beast they had just released. Instinct dictated that they prepare for the worst. The soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons, though none of them truly wanted to use them. They had come this far to help, not to harm, but they knew that a wounded animal could be unpredictable. If fear or pain triggered an aggressive response, they would have no choice but to defend themselves. Their bodies remained tense, ready to react at the slightest sign of hostility. The bear let out a deep exhale, lowering its massive head slightly. Its dark eyes flickered from one soldier to another, studying them, its expression unreadable. The air was thick with uncertainty, the tension unbearable. Would it lash out? Would it charge forward, mistaking them for a threat? The soldiers braced themselves, expecting an explosion of movement at any second. Then the bear did something no one expected. Instead of roaring or attacking, it slowly lowered itself onto its front paws. It tested its wounded leg, wincing slightly, but it did not react with anger. Instead, it remained still, breathing heavily, as if trying to understand what had just happened. There was no sign of aggression, no sign of hostility, just an exhausted, injured creature processing its newfound freedom. One of the soldiers exhaled in quiet relief, his grip loosening slightly. The others remained cautious, but it was clear that something remarkable had just occurred. The bear, despite its suffering, was not reacting with violence. It had not fled in panic, nor retaliated in fear. It simply stood there, staring at the very people who had set it free. For the first time since they had heard its cries, the soldiers felt something shift in the air. This was not just an animal acting on instinct. There was something deeper, something unspoken. The bear understood, at least in some way, that these men had helped it. And that realization left the soldiers more awestruck than anything else. The soldiers remained still, their breaths shallow as they observed the bear's every movement. It was free, yet it did not bolt into the forest as they had expected. Instead, it stood there, towering over them, its massive chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Its dark eyes flickered from one soldier to another, lingering in a way that felt almost deliberate. There was no aggression in its posture, no signs of fear or rage. It was as if the bear was taking in its surroundings, processing what had just happened. The soldiers had expected chaos, a frantic escape, or even an attack. But instead, they were met with something entirely different. Something that almost resembled gratitude. One soldier swallowed hard, glancing at his companions. None of them spoke, but they all felt it. A strange sense of understanding passed between them and the creature they had saved. The bear shifted its weight, testing its wounded leg again. It winced but did not growl or show signs of distress. It knew it had been freed, and somehow it seemed to know who had done it. Still, no one moved. They did not want to startle the bear or break whatever unspoken connection had formed in this moment. The air between them was thick with an unexplainable energy. Something rare, something profound. Then, to their astonishment, the bear did not turn to leave. Instead, it lingered, standing there as if deciding its next move. It blinked slowly, its gaze steady but calm. Some of the soldiers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from caution to something closer to wonder. One of them whispered under his breath, barely believing what he was seeing. Was it possible that the bear recognized their help? That in some way it understood that these men were not its enemies? Logic told them that wild animals did not think this way, that they acted on pure instinct. And yet in that moment, none of them could deny what they were witnessing. The bear took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. It turned its head slightly, glancing in the direction of the forest. The moment had lasted longer than any of them had anticipated, and as surreal as it was, something told them this encounter was not over yet. The soldiers remained rooted in place, expecting the bear to retreat into the forest at any moment. Its freedom had been restored, its suffering eased. There was no reason for it to stay. Yet the massive creature lingered, its deep breath steady, its dark eyes flickering with an unreadable expression. Then, without warning, the bear shifted its weight, turned, and began to walk. Its movements were slow, deliberate, its injured leg causing a slight limp. At first, the soldiers thought it was finally leaving, disappearing into the depths of the wilderness where it belonged. But then something strange happened. The bear paused a few paces ahead and looked back. Its gaze met theirs again, and for a moment it simply stood there, watching them. Then it took another step forward, stopping once more to glance over its shoulder. It was as if it was waiting for them. The soldiers exchanged wary glances. Their instincts told them to be cautious. Following a wild animal, especially one that had just been released from a painful trap, was not something any of them had planned for. It could still be dangerous. It could still lash out if it felt threatened. Yet there was something about the bear's behavior that made them hesitate. One of the soldiers murmured under his breath, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Is it trying to lead us somewhere?" It seemed absurd, impossible even, but none of them could deny what they were seeing. The bear was not simply leaving, it was moving with purpose, its occasional glances back at them almost beckoning. For a few tense moments, no one moved. Then their leader made a decision. They had come this far, stepping beyond their training, beyond their usual protocols to save this creature's life. If there was something more to this situation, if the bear was indeed trying to show them something, then they owed it to themselves to find out. Without a word, he gestured for the others to follow. Carefully, cautiously, they moved after the bear, keeping a safe distance but staying close enough to track its path. The animal made no attempt to run, nor did it seem alarmed by their presence. It simply kept walking, pausing now and then to ensure they were still behind it. With every step, the soldiers felt the weight of an unfolding mystery. This was no ordinary rescue, no simple mission. Something was happening, something none of them could yet understand. And whatever it was, the bear was leading them straight to it. The soldiers followed the bear deeper into the forest, their boots pressing silently against the damp earth. The dense canopy above swallowed what little sunlight remained, casting long shadows over the twisted branches and thick undergrowth. They moved cautiously, every step filled with uncertainty. The bear, though injured, pressed forward with determination, never once hesitating. It was clear now. This was no random path. The creature was leading them somewhere. Minutes passed, the silence of the forest weighing heavily upon them. The only sound was the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the distance. Despite their training, the soldiers felt a growing unease. They had stepped far beyond their original mission, venturing into something far greater than they had anticipated. Then the bear suddenly stopped. Its massive frame stiffened as it let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something softer, almost mournful. The soldiers halted immediately, scanning the area for whatever had caught the bear's attention. The thick underbrush obscured their vision, but as they stepped forward, they saw it. A small mound of fur, barely moving, pinned beneath a fallen tree. It was a bear cub. The tiny creature lay motionless, its breathing shallow and weak. Its soft whimpers were barely audible, its body struggling to move beneath the heavy weight of the tree trunk. The soldiers exchanged quick glances, realization dawning upon them. This was why the bear had led them here. This was why it had been trapped in the first place. The mother had been trying to reach her baby. One soldier exhaled sharply, his hands clenching into fists. The pieces fell into place now. The mother bear had likely heard its cub's desperate cries and rushed to help, only to fall victim to the hidden snare along the way. Trapped and in pain, she had been unable to do anything but call out for help until the soldiers had arrived. The bear let out another deep sound, stepping carefully toward the cub. Its injured leg trembled beneath its weight, but it pushed forward, lowering its massive head near the trapped baby. The cub let out a faint, pained whimper, reaching out a small paw toward its mother. The sight was enough to make even the most hardened of soldiers feel a sting in their chest. Without hesitation, the team sprang into action. They had freed the mother. Now they had to save her child. The soldiers wasted no time. The sight of the helpless cub, barely moving beneath the fallen tree, ignited an urgency in them that pushed aside all hesitation. They had already saved the mother, but if they did not act quickly, the cub would not survive much longer. Carefully, they assessed the situation. The tree was thick and heavy, its damp bark covered in moss. It had likely fallen due to a storm, its jagged branches tangled with the underbrush. The cub's small frame was partially pinned beneath it, its tiny body shivering from exhaustion. Its breaths were shallow, its eyes barely open. It had been trapped for too long. The mother bear remained still, her massive body tense. Despite her injury, she did not growl or move aggressively. Instead, she stood protectively close, watching the soldiers with an intensity that sent shivers down their spines. She understood what they were doing. Two soldiers knelt beside the tree, pressing their hands against the rough surface. They exchanged a quick nod before digging their boots into the soft earth, preparing to lift. Others gathered nearby, ready to assist. Every move had to be precise. If they startled the cub or moved too suddenly, the mother might react unpredictably. With a deep breath, they heaved. The log shifted slightly but did not lift. It was heavier than expected, deeply embedded into the damp soil. They adjusted their grip, tightening their muscles as they pushed again. The strain was evident, their breaths coming in sharp bursts. Slowly, inch by inch, the tree began to rise. The cub let out a faint whimper, its small body twitching as the weight pressing down on it lessened. Encouraged, the soldiers pushed harder, using every ounce of strength to lift the tree just enough for another soldier to reach in. Carefully, he slid his arms beneath the cub's frail body, gently pulling it free from the trap that had nearly claimed its life. The moment the cub was released, the mother bear let out a deep, resonant sound. It was not a growl, but something softer, almost relieved. The tiny bear wobbled unsteadily, its weak legs barely able to support its weight. Then, with visible effort, it took a few trembling steps toward its mother. The soldiers remained frozen as the mother bear lowered her massive head, nudging the cub gently with her nose. The little one let out a weak but reassuring sound, pressing itself against her thick fur. It was safe now. A heavy silence hung in the air. The soldiers, despite their training, felt something profound settle in their chests. This was more than just a rescue. It was a moment they would never forget. The soldiers took a slow step back, their breaths steady but their hearts racing. The tension that had gripped them for so long began to fade, replaced by something far more profound. They had done it. The cub was free, reunited with its mother, no longer trapped beneath the crushing weight of the fallen tree. Yet none of them knew what to expect next. The mother bear remained still, her massive frame towering over her fragile cub. She lowered her head, nuzzling the small creature with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible for something so powerful. The cub let out a faint, breathy sound, pressing against its mother's fur as if drawing strength from her presence. The soldiers had seen many things in their time: hardship, conflict, survival against the odds. But nothing had prepared them for this moment. One of them exhaled, lowering his hands from his weapon. The rest followed, their bodies slowly relaxing. There was no threat here anymore, only understanding. The mother bear lifted her head, her dark eyes meeting theirs once again. It was not fear or aggression that filled her gaze, but something far deeper, something that none of them could quite put into words. She did not growl, did not retreat in haste. She simply looked at them, as though committing their faces to memory. For a long moment, nothing moved. The forest held its breath, as though nature itself had paused to witness the exchange. Then, without a sound, the bear turned. She moved with slow, deliberate steps, her injured legs still weak but no longer holding her back. The cub followed closely, stumbling at first but keeping pace, never straying too far from its mother's side. They walked together, their figures blending into the dense foliage of the trees. The soldiers watched in silence as the mother and her child disappeared into the wilderness, their massive forms swallowed by the shadows of the forest. There was no dramatic farewell, no final gesture, only the quiet understanding that this encounter had changed something in all of them. Even as the forest returned to life around them, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the soldiers remained still. What they had just experienced was rare, almost unreal. And as they finally turned to leave, none of them could shake the feeling that, in some way, the bear had truly understood what they had done for her. The soldiers walked back through the dense forest in silence, their thoughts weighed down by the events of the past few hours. The mission they had set out on that morning had been routine, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet somehow they had found themselves in the middle of something extraordinary, something that defied logic and reason, but left an unshakable mark on their hearts. None of them spoke at first. There were no words that could adequately capture what they had just witnessed. They had seen the raw, brutal side of nature many times before: predators hunting, the struggle for survival, the indifferent cruelty of the wild. But this was different. This was not about survival alone. This had been about something deeper, something almost sacred. One of the soldiers glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the bear watching them from a distance. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its usual rhythm, as if their presence had never disrupted its flow. And yet they all knew that something had changed. Despite their training, despite the hardened exterior that came with years of discipline and endurance, they had been moved in a way they never thought possible. The moment the mother bear had looked at them before disappearing into the wilderness would stay with them forever. That silent acknowledgement, that shared understanding between man and beast, was unlike anything they had ever experienced. For years, they had been conditioned to see the world in black and white, friend or foe, threat or safety. But today, they had been reminded that not everything followed those rules. Kindness, even in the most unexpected moments, had the power to bridge worlds that were never meant to meet. As they neared their base, the soldiers exchanged quiet glances. The weight of the moment settling in, they would return to their usual duties, their routines, their missions. But this story, this experience would remain with them. It was not a tale of battle or survival, but of compassion, of courage, of an unspoken bond between humans and the wild. And though they would never see that bear again, they knew that somewhere deep in the forest, she walked with her cub, alive, free, and carrying the same unspoken memory of the ones who had saved them.